Hello everyone, it's Adrian. Welcome back to ALTERKNIT. If you guys were watching my video last week, you will know that I was super excited to do a couple of videos for you this week. One, a yarn unboxing, and another, a review of that yarn. However, it pains me to say that I didn't receive the yarn in time. And despite what Reese thinks, I feel like I've always received it within this time frame. Something has gone wrong with the delivery. I think it's been like lost or delayed or something like that. It seemed to tour New England when it left Connecticut, and it took about 3 days to get to New York. And then it went from New York to LA, and then it went from LA and went to Sydney, and it sat in Sydney for a week, and it's never done that before. Reese called USPS to find out what was going on, and they couldn't help once it left the country, and Australia Post was, as usual, no better. So fingers crossed that I get it for next week. The unhelpful lady at Australia Post said, give it at least another week. And I definitely hope it doesn't take that long. However, I am really excited. It's given me an opportunity to talk to you guys today about knitting in the round, or circular knitting, as opposed to flat knitting. So stick around, because I think it's gonna be, useful for everyone. Definitely if you're a beginner and you don't even know what those terms are, or if you do know and you've been thinking about getting into it, but you're a little concerned that it looks very difficult or technical, stay tuned, because it's not really at all that difficult. Knitting in the round. Why even bother knitting in the round? I hear one or two of you ask. Well, I mean, knitting in the round has some benefits over knitting in the flat, or knitting flat. This is the traditional method of knitting, knitting flat. It's what we pretty much all start off doing, and that's to create rectangular pieces of fabric or other shaped pieces of fabric that have a right side and a reverse side, or a wrong side. Typically for garment construction, things have been made in panels and then seamed together to create, a shirt which is a tubular piece of fabric, if you deconstruct it and have a look. It has distinct advantages in some instances. For example, scarves and shawls should not be knit in the round because they are flat pieces of fabric. Blankets, of course, another obvious choice for knitting flat. But knitting in the round has its advantages too, and the biggest thing that I can think of off the top of my head is a sock. I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who would prefer socks that were knit as a flat piece of fabric and then seamed up, given that the seam would probably occur on the inside of the garment, and that would be kind of uncomfortable to walk around on or have in your shoe. So being able to knit it without any seams at all has a distinct advantage, and you would knit in the round to knit a sock. Other things that you would you would use circular knitting for would be gloves and mitts, even beanies, although you can, of course, knit beanies flat and seam them up. I find it personally just a lot easier to knit them in the round. You can knit full garments like sweaters or jumpers in the round as well, and you can do this without any seams, so a single piece of tubular fabric. And I know if you haven't had experience doing this, you're thinking, okay, well, hang on. You have, yes, the tube from the waist up to the neck, but then you've got an arm that's another tube, and it can actually be done without any seaming at all. I know, sounds like magic if you are uninitiated. I have not, well, I did start a jumper knit in the round and I never finished it, but what I'm working on currently is a knit in flat and seamed up, mainly because the seams are part of the detailing of the sweater. When you knit in the round, you are going to need special equipment. Now I know there might be one or two of you out there that say, hang on, you can actually knit in the round using standard single pointed needles. I don't know this technique. I'm not gonna be showing you that today or talking about it today, apart from just right now. So let's move on. Here I have just a tiny little bit of tubular fabric that I knit yesterday in preparation for this, just to show you how you knit in the round with double pointed needles. Now these are, just as they sound, needles that have a point on either end. They usually come in sets of 5, and you can cast your stitches onto 3 or 4 needles. You wouldn't go any lower than 3 because it's difficult to make a circle with just 2 needles. And then you would use the spare 5th needle if you've cast onto 4 to actually work the stitches. Now this is great because there's no seam. I can show you where I started the knitting, but there is, you won't be able to see it, but there's no seam. So this is one method of knitting in the round. And one of the huge benefits of using double pointed needles is that you can actually dictate the diameter of the knitting. You can make it big. I could fill these needles with stitches and have a beanie knit out of these, or I can make socks for a baby. So that's why double pointed needles are really versatile. They look super confusing, but they are not. It's pretty much the same as working with just 2 needles. And I'll show you that in a bit. Now, the other method of knitting in the round is using circular needles. And if you've seen my review of the Addi Click System interchangeable needle set, I briefly spoke about how you use circular needles. And this is it here. So basically it's 2 short needle tips made from various different materials connected by a flexible cord in the middle that are going to hold your stitches. Now, these are super versatile and I really love them because you can knit flat. I can knit a panel of a jumper using this, or I could connect it and create a tube of fabric coming out through there. I'm sorry, I talk with my hands a lot and sometimes it's a bit weird and meaningless. And it's very simple to convert using these for flat work into circular work, knitting in the round. So I'm going to get started with talking about how to knit in the round using circular needles like this. So I've cast on all of the stitches that I'm going to need. I'll cast on, I've left a very short tail. I'm going to cast on 1 more. And if you want to know how to cast on, I have a tutorial about the long tail cast on that you can click here in the description box below and see how to do that. All right, so I've gotten to the end of my cast on and I need to make sure that I can actually stretch my stitches all the way from one needle tip to another, which I can with this work. So typically what you would do if you were knitting flat is you would change from holding the needle in the right hand to holding the needle in the left hand, and you would then start by inserting the needle in and knitting like this. However, what we're going to do is actually keep the right needle in the right hand, and we're going to pick up the left needle that has the very first stitch that we cast on, our slip knot right here on the left, and we're going to knit with yarn in back. So remember, we want the yarn behind our needle, so it looks like it's in front of it to you, but to me, the yarn is behind the needle. We're going to insert knitwise, knit a stitch, and now it's all connected in the round. It is one tube. It's really that simple. All you do is not turn the work, basically, and you would continue as per the pattern. Now, you're not knitting rows anymore, you're knitting a spiral of work. So basically when you knit all the way around and come back to the beginning, you have created another row and it's a spiral of work that goes up. Now this can cause problems with color work because you'll get a jog, which means the colors won't seamlessly match. There will be a distinct jog between lines of color. But this is not insurmountable. There are methods that you can use to fix that. You may want to use a stitch marker to let you know when the end of a round is, particularly if you are doing color work or if you have lace pattern that you need to match rows below and rows above. And a stitch marker can basically be anything that will fit around the knitting needle, like a little loop. Some people can, I've seen people using bread ties, but this is, I mean, they're not that expensive to get stitch markers. I knew being a slob would come in handy. This is a little stitch marker. You may not be able to see that, just a little bright green stitch marker, and it's probably not going to fit too well. Yeah, I mean, it's just something that indicates the end of a row. Now, one of the things that will blow your mind if you're a beginner and you're starting to knit in the round is that fabric won't be constructed exactly the same as if you knit flat. For example, if you want to knit stockinette stitch or stockinette fabric, you're going to knit all of the stitches, and then on the reverse side, you're going to purl all of the stitches. But because you're always working on the same side of the fabric, to knit stockinette in the round, all you have to do is knit every single stitch. It's really that easy. Damn camera stopping recording, frustrates me. All right, what I was talking about when the camera cut out was that you know, the fabric is constructed quite differently when you knit in the round. And you know, if we were just to knit every stitch in flat knitting, then we would get garter stitch. But you actually need to knit one row, then purl one row, knit another row, purl another row for you to get garter stitch when you're knitting in the round. And yeah, basically knitting every stitch will give you stockinette, which is great because we do use larger areas of stockinette than we do garter stitch most of the time. So it's a little bit easier for those of us who are kind of lazy and just think sometimes I just want to knit. What the camera also did not record was me showing you how to cast on with double pointed needles, but to be honest, let's take a closer look at that because I think it's a little bit too confusing in this format. Okay, so you can see here that this is knit in the round. It's just one piece of fabric, no seams. So this is the cast on edge here. And as you can see, if I stretch it all out there, there's no way of telling that this was the end of one row or the beginning of another row, which is actually a really useful thing to have if you want to have seamless things like socks, mittens, sleeves, and actually just an entire sweater without seams. So I'm going to show you a closer up view of a couple of different ways that you can do that. Alright, so I've already cast on a bunch of stitches on a circular needle here. And as I've said before, this is just short needle tips that are connected by a thin flexible cord that are going to hold all of your stitches. So you're going to cast on the number of stitches that the pattern calls for, and when you've done that, normally what we would do is turn the work. So all of the stitches cast onto the right needle, and we would then turn that into the left needle. We're not going to do that this time, so we'll keep them all there in the right hand side. We want to make sure that the spine of the stitches all lines up in the one direction. We don't want any twists like this here. So we're just going to make sure that all of the stitches line up correctly and on the inside of the loop that we're going to knit in. This is important because if you continue knitting when there's been a twist in the work, it won't immediately become apparent, but later on you'll have this twisted Mobius strip of fabric that is not useful to anybody, so avoid doing that. So we make sure, yep, all of our stitches are lined up, and laying it flat on a table like this is actually a really useful way of doing so. The principles of circular knitting are pretty simple. We're going to connect the last stitch that we cast on to the very first stitch that we cast on. And in fact, this is the slip knot. So I'm going to distribute it so that the tail end of the cast on stitches is near the tip of the needle, and I'm just going to, knit as usual. And there we have it, connected. I was saying before that you can use the stitch marker, and you probably should use the stitch marker to indicate the end of one row and the beginning of another, because as I showed you with this bit of fabric here, it's going to be pretty seamless, and it'll be hard for you to find out where the beginning of the end is. And that's essentially how you knit in the round on circular needles. Pretty simple. Okay, so if you want to knit something with a pretty small circumference, like the band of a sock or a mitt or even a cap, then you can't do it on the circular. Well, you can do it on circular needles, but that's magic loop. It's not just standard knitting in the round. And as you can see, no matter how much you're going to spread out stitches around this circular needle, this sock, you'll never be able to knit it on this, and this is basically the smallest that it goes in terms of circular needles. So you're going to need double pointed needles. Now they are, just as they sound, needles with a point on either end. And a lot of people find these a bit intimidating just because when you're knitting with double pointed needles, there's a lot going on. But they're not too scary, and I'll show you how to use those now. Basically, you can either knit in the round with 3 needles like this, or you can knit with 4 needles like this. Now, it isn't really a stupid question to wonder if this is going to produce square knitting and if this is going to produce triangular knitting, but it doesn't. Everything comes out as a circle. So don't worry about whether or not you're using 3 or 4 needles. It will basically depend on the pattern that you're knitting at the time. For example, if I am knitting, if I'm casting on 30 stitches or something like 90 stitches, it's probably easier to use the 3 needles. However, if there are 4 distinct sections to the work, it's probably best for you to distribute those over 4 needles. I'm going to use 4 needles today, so I'll show you how to cast on. I'll get my trusty yarn here. I'm going to do long tail again, so I'll get a bit of yarn happening out of the sides. Now, it's pretty much the same as any other kind of knitting with casting on. I'm going to start off with a slip knot, and I'm going to pop it on the needle like that. And I'm just going to cast on some stitches using long tail cast on method. Okay, so I've cast on, I don't even count, probably around about 10 stitches on this needle, and that's all I want to put on this needle. or how many stitches I want on this needle at the end. I can cast on every stitch that I'm going to need and then simply get another of the needles and slip them from one needle to the other. But I find that that just creates extra work, so what I'd prefer to do is cast directly onto another needle. Now what I'm going to do is grab the yarn as if to do another long tail cast on, but I'm going to drop that needle behind my finger and just start off with a new needle. And it's a little bit loose at first, but just keep it nice and tight and keep casting on. And it's as easy as that, really. Okay, so you can see I've got, say, 10 stitches here and 10 stitches here. Again, I haven't been counting. And I'm going to put some stitches on my third needle. So I'm going to, again, drop that needle. And I'm casting on to a third needle now. So I'm going to skip ahead and put this on 4 needles, and I will see you shortly. Okay, so I've cast onto 4 different needles, and I'm just arranging them in a square here, mainly so that I can show you that yes, it will create a tube of fabric, but also because it's really important to make sure that the spine of your stitches is all facing all on the same side of the needle. We don't want any that are twisted around the needle, because as I said before, that's going to create a really unusable, twisted lot of fabric that you just don't want. And it's kind of hard to recognize immediately that you've done this. So it can create a bit of heartache that you have to unknit some work. All right, so what I'm going to do now, as it's the same with double pointed needles as it is with the circular needles, I'm going to connect the last stitch that I cast on to the very first stitch, the slip knot that I cast on. But instead of going from one needle to another, I'm actually going to pick up the spare needle, the 5th needle, insert that knitwise into the very first cast on. You can see there's no yarn connected to it. And I'm going to get the leading yarn, or the yarn connected to the ball of wool. And that's connected to the last needle. Call that needle number 4. And I'm just going to knit. And so what I've done there, and I'm going to pull that a little bit tighter, is I have connected the end of the cast on to the beginning of the cast on. So now it's one long circle of fabric, and I can just knit as normal. And now you see here, I'm actually just holding needle number 1 and needle number 5 in my hands. The other 3 are just hanging back behind the work, doing whatever they want to do, and I don't have to worry too much about them. So while it looks visually confusing, I really am just knitting with 2 needles. So I'll knit all of these stitches from needle 1 to needle 5, and I'm getting to my last 2 stitches. Knit that last one there. Now I have an empty needle in my left hand, and I have 10 or so stitches in what was the empty needle, or needle number 5. So I'm going to get this, which was needle number 1, and that will now become my empty needle in my right hand. I'll pick up needle number 2, slide the stitches to the other point, and this is why it's useful to have double pointed needles, and I'll just continue knitting. Now with the first 2 stitches of a new needle, it's important to do these quite tightly, because you don't want to create a ladder running up the work. If we're going to the effort to create a tube of fabric to make sure we don't have any seams, it would be such a shame to have a ladder in the work, which is pretty much just as bad as a seam in my opinion. So we knit it and pull tight. Knit the second and pull tight again. So you're going to keep the tension quite firm there, but now you can relax and knit at your normal tension for the rest of that row, or the rest of the stitches on that needle. Okay, so I'm going to knit this last stitch on this particular needle, and now I've got an empty needle again. And Reese brought up a good question, which is, how do I know which needle to knit on next? Well, the work will tell you. So if you kind of open it up to create a little square again, you'll see that this was the work that you just knit, and the very next stitch along is on this needle. So we're going to slide the work to the tip, and that will become my left-hand needle. And as always, an empty needle will become your right-hand needle. You will probably fall into the trap of just continuing on with one of the needles that already has stitches on it, and it'll take until it gets very tight for you to notice that you actually have now dropped down to 3 needles knitting in the round, and that's fine. You can just unknit or slip them back onto the other needle, it's fine. So I'm not going to continue on with that, but if you go round and round and round, you're going to get quite a small diameter tube of stockinette stitch if you continue knitting all stitches. And that's knitting in the round with double pointed needles. Okay guys, so that's basically it. I hope you found this video on circular knitting versus flat knitting to be useful, and to sort of break down some of those barriers that I know we can have when we're a little afraid to try a new technique. So don't be afraid, give it a go. Just practice casting on and connecting in the round, and making sure that the spine of the stitches is within the interior of the loop that you're knitting. Stay tuned for next week. If you haven't subscribed already, please do, so that you get a notification when this yarn finally arrives and I get to do another unboxing and a yarn review. All right, until next week, stay cool. I will see you then. Bye.